Well, good morning. I'm Sean O'Keefe. I'm a senior advisor here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a faculty member at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. And I'm pleased to welcome you all here to a very, very important discussion on strategic national security space and the 2019 Budget Forum. On behalf of Dr. John Hamre, the CEO and President of CSIS, I'm pleased to see you all here and appreciate the time that you're spending, particularly at this early convening hour, as well as our deep appreciation to our honored guests here this morning, who will be the first speakers up. The standard safety announcement that John always insists on is to assure everybody that in the event of a circumstance or emergency, there are exits to be marked on either side here and out the front. And Todd Harrison will be the designated safety officer. So you win the tag this morning there in the event of something. The purpose of the event is to raise awareness and understanding of the funding priorities for national security space programs in the Fiscal Year 19 budget request. In the course of my career, both in the Pentagon as well as at NASA, I found the collaboration between military or national security space-related activities as well as the commercial or civil space activities as well. While there is a separation from its origins that was established by the original law in 1958, nonetheless established an extraordinarily important collaboration. And I'm very impressed that the efforts that Todd Harrison has made here to bring these communities together on common issues of technology, application, and a wide range of different challenges that are similar and very, very much of the same origins for both communities are, in their best circumstances, most impressive when there's a collaboration involved. The organizational issues are not inconsequential between the two communities, but nonetheless, and even within the communities themselves, there are a wide range of different separations, divisions, cultures, and agendas and objectives and everything else. But at its core, there are some very common kinds of circumstances that are engaged that are important to do. And I found, in fact, that when it worked on either side, be it at the times that I was at the Pentagon or at NASA, where those collaborations worked successfully, they worked very successfully, to greater gain, to greater advantage, to greater efficiency and improvement. And so while that may be in part an element of the discussion here involved, it also, I think, really focuses today on the specific issues of national security space and the challenges therein. And they derive from the same kinds of issues that motivate the differences between the elements as well. I want to thank our sponsors for helping support the event: the Braxton Science and Technology Group, the Inmarsat Government, Intelsat General Corporation, LinQuest Corporation, Millennium Space Systems, Orbital ATK, SES Government Solutions, and Vox Space. But I want to specifically thank as well Jacques and Associates for helping to organize the event. And I want to invite Steve Jacques to the stage to say a few words as well to welcome you all. Again, thank you all very much, and I'm looking forward to the conference.
Well, good morning, everybody. How are you? Everybody awake? Everybody alive? I got to say something about Sean. A lot of you folks know that Sean was once the DoD Comptroller, Secretary of the Navy, OMB Director, NASA Administrator, esteemed leader in aerospace, academia. But those of us who've been around a while know you, John, Leo, as a SACD Staff Director. That's what we remember. And that might have been some of your fun times as well. So it's good to see you again. On behalf of the Jakes and Associates Pinnacle Engineering team, I just wanted to thank you all for coming and welcome you all here. It's really a privilege from our standpoint to be a part of the CSIS team. We really feel privileged to be able to be a part of this great organization. They take on tough challenges. We admire CSIS for that. Todd, the work that you and your team do is outstanding, and we wanted to just take a moment to thank you and for giving us a chance to help you out in this event today. Fantastic, we appreciate it. As Sean pointed out, we're really in for a treat this morning to hear some congressional perspectives from HASC Strat Forces Subcommittee Chair and Ranking Members Mr. Rogers and Jim Cooper, as well as the Space Power Caucus co-chairs Doug Lamborn and Dutch Ruppersberger later. I would like to say to our esteemed congressional guests that we truly thank you for your continued leadership in elevating these very important issues of national security, space, organization, leadership within the Department of Defense. While there may be some details remaining about the work to be done in the future, the very fact that you've demonstrated concern and are resolved to solutions is very much appreciated by us all. Thank you, sir. We appreciate that. And as you see on the remainder of the agenda this morning, I think many of you all are here to see Mike Tierney and his magic with budget presentations and whatnot. He's our pride and joy at Jakes & Associates. He's promised to put out a pretty cool slicing and dicing of the numbers today. So throw it at him, throw all the questions at him that you want to, because I don't think there's anybody in town here who knows this, the structure and the depth of stuff among his many other talents as Mike does. He's fast become the town's, one of the town's preeminent folks that are being looked upon for consult and insights on what's going on in the space budget. So looking forward to Mike's pretty slick little conversation. Technology, hopefully notwithstanding. I think we'll get there. And of course, rounding out the event this morning, Todd will be a part of an esteemed panel. We're really looking forward to what they all have to say. Echoing also Sean's thanks to the sponsors of the events. As they always say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as a free launch. Ask ULA and SpaceX that. And there's no such thing as a free breakfast, and there's no such thing as a free budget forum. So were it not for the financial contributions by you all, as you're listed down here, we just wouldn't be able to do this. CSIS couldn't do it. So thank you very much for that. And so with that, I'm happy to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Todd Harrison and the rest of the crowd. Enjoy the morning. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Todd Harrison, Senior Fellow here at CSIS. As I've noted before, this is kind of the collision of my two worlds. So I am the director of the Aerospace Security Project here, where I focus a lot on space security issues. I'm also the director of Defense Budget Analysis, where I do analysis of the defense budget. So when the opportunity came to host this event, I thought, hey, this is perfect. Right up my alley. And I'm really pleased to have this morning, as our opening panel, two of the leading voices in Congress when it comes to national security space. To my right here, we have Representative Mike Rogers, who represents the 3rd District in Alabama, which includes Auburn University, we were talking about before. And Representative Rogers is the chairman of the House Armed Services Strategic Forces Subcommittee, and has been leading the charge on issues of improving space resilience, space power, and reorganizing space within DoD. And on the end here, we have Representative Jim Cooper. He represents Tennessee's 5th Congressional District. He is the ranking member on the House Armed Services Strategic Forces Subcommittee. And you know, it's great to have both of you to not only represent the bipartisan nature of a lot of space issues, but the two of you have worked very closely on a lot of space issues in Congress. So I'll start out, Representative Rogers, I'll go to you for some opening remarks.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me here today. Appreciate it. And anytime we get the opportunity to talk about national security space and its importance and our concern about making some modifications that get us into a better position than we are now. I'm not going to get into, I was asked to talk a little about priorities, but I think that y'all want to spend most time on Q&A, so I won't give you my prepared remarks unless you just really want them. But other than that, I'd say I'm glad to be here and look forward to your questions.
Oh, and I should note, before we go to you, Representative Cooper, we have a website where folks can ask questions. So if you take out your phone, you go to this web address, ask us a question electronically. So that works for people who are at home watching online, as well as people who are here in the room. Submit your question. I get to see it on the tablet up here at the front of the room, and I'll ask it. Representative Cooper.
This is a historic moment because this is the first time the chairman has ever made a shorter speech than mine. Normally I just say what he said, except for the Roll Tide part. And he didn't even say that today. So.
I'm getting there.
But he only says that to make it harder to translate into Russian and Chinese. But I'm honored to be here. We couldn't do this without the excellent staff work that we both receive. Leonor Tomero is here early in the morning, David Bate also, so we appreciate your great help and assistance. This is at least a small example that Congress can work effectively together on a bipartisan basis. Now we're still working on bicameralism. Our Senate friends, in our opinion, were not as alert to the need for birthing a Space Corps as we were, but hopefully that will be corrected in a coming session. There are so many important issues to talk about. Many of them are highly technical. We should probably allow more time for Q&A. So thank you, Todd, for convening us.
Sure thing. Well, so let's start with Chairman Rogers. You know, with all of the things that are, on the plate for DoD today, the threats we're facing, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, continuing to battle terrorism in various parts of the world. When it comes to space, what do you think the priorities need to be for DoD right now when it comes to space programs?
First, I think they've got to figure out how to move faster. We have really allowed ourselves to get marred down in bureaucracy when it comes to procuring capabilities to compete with our adversaries. It was jarring to our committee a little over a year ago to have John Hyten come in and tell us that China was our, if not our near peer, our peer in space, and Russia our near peer. And then have Admiral Haney tell us at PACOM not long after that, no, they're both our peers now. That's unacceptable that we've allowed that to happen, particularly in a day and age when it is essential to have those space capabilities to fight and win wars. It wasn't when we first went into Iraq and Afghanistan 15 years ago. But now it's a part of everyday life in fighting and winning wars. And we've allowed that capability to atrophy, while at the same time our adversaries have recognized it's a vulnerability. So they have weaponized space in the meantime, by the way, while we haven't. So these things really, kind of shocked our conscience as we were looking at space a little over a year ago, and it gave us a sense of urgency to try to find a solution. The disappointing thing is that the more we looked at it, the more we became convinced that it can't be fixed within the Air Force the way it is structured now. And that's what put us on the path to where we came with our mark, came out of the House last year.
So, Representative Cooper, what are your thoughts?
Well, the community knows this. 40 years of relying on RD-180, a Russian launch vehicle, unfilled billets at SMC for decades. So we blame our lagging space environment due to a poor school system in LA. Other things, failure to promote within the space part of the Air Force. Test example this last time, of 32 people becoming general, 30 fighter pilots, and nobody on the space side until the Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson, promoted a woman, which is great, but that's at best a token effort. You have to have a robust, aggressive, super capable space contingent in whatever form, and have had the R&D budget at a 30-year low recently. Thankfully, due to the efforts of this Congress, finally we have budget certainty. Finally, we have a more robust budget. But we need the Air Force still to get more organized. And the A11 wasn't the right answer. The PDSA was not the right answer. So hopefully the Air Force will come around and help us in finding the right answer.
And so I want to follow up, on some of the initiatives that made it into the FY18 NDAA. So you did give the Air Force some more authorities. Can you talk about that a bit? What authorities did you give, and how do you see the Air Force starting to implement the changes that were mandated in the FY18 NDAA?
It'd be nice to know what they're going to do. We gave them what they asked for. We told them we're going to proceed with our efforts to start to develop a segregated Space Corps within the Department of the Air Force. But they wanted the power to organize, train, and equip. We gave it to them. They wanted more money and budget certainty for 2 years. They got it. So I'd like to see them here today to explain what they're going to do with it. They chose not to be here, but we're still waiting to see what they're going to do.
Part of the NDAA was to authorize a study from an outside independent think tank as to exactly how it should be organized. And we shouldn't get mired down in the details. Sadly, in some of our internal discussions, there was a focus on uniform design. Like, who cares? Who cares if our brilliant scientists have tattoos and body piercing? What matters is capability. And here, our Air Force friends, we need to focus more on that. And also speed of acquisition. Here we have an interesting control group situation with the NRO, which generally with a flatter organizational structure has been able to perform much more agilely and robustly. So why can't the Air Force learn from that? We instead tend to be mired in bureaucracy. And there are many strengths of bureaucracy, but we haven't seen those in space yet.
And Jim makes a great point. One of the main things that we would like to see them do voluntarily is restructure and weed out some of the bureaucracy in their procurement acquisition system. That was one of the glaring problem areas that we initially were drawn to. And they've got a lot of latitude, but we haven't seen them be able to make that change. And that's one of the problems we felt like in keeping national security space in the Air Force is that culturally they're so indoctrinated to the way they do things that they can't make themselves do it differently. Whereas I think once that we have the Space Corps segregated, we can start with a clean sheet on what that acquisition system will be like and make sure it doesn't get blown up with bureaucracy so that it can be more agile. General Hyten talked about at the Reagan Defense Forum last year, how frustrated it was that it's taking 8 to 10 years to get new capabilities up in space when the private sector is doing it in 18 to 24 months. And that we need to stop putting up these big monstrous satellites. They have a lot of capability, but they're also huge targets for our adversaries. And we ought to be throwing up a lot more frequent, smaller satellites with more narrow capabilities, but collectively they still give us the same potential. But again, I don't think that the Air Force can culturally change the way it does things.
And some of the ideas have been thrown out there to help change the way the Air Force does space acquisitions, but also to help speed the pace of acquisitions. One is creating a separate acquisition workforce for space within the Air Force, people that are dedicated to space acquisitions that are not generalists. Another is maybe give some additional flexibility in the way money can be spent so they don't have to wait for a 2-year budget cycle, because if you're trying to innovate, having to go through the whole PPBE process of planning and programming money, it just takes too long. You'll miss opportunities. So maybe something like a working capital fund for space innovation. Are those kinds of changes that Congress would be open to or that you would like to see, things that the Air Force can do on its own?
I'd be happy to. I would like for them to propose that a year ago instead of fighting us and just tell us what they're going to do differently while we continue down this path. But those are wonderful ideas for them to start implementing while we're creating the Space Corps.
The first challenge that Mike faced as chairman of the committee was clearing out the underbrush, and to have 60 bureaucrats able to say no, that makes it very difficult to get anything done. So that's part of the process of making sure that positive decisions can be made.
But I would also go back to this. Even if they made the structural changes that you described, which are good, the money is still the problem. What we have found in looking at this is that over the years, the Air Force has used the space budget as a money pot to reach into and pull money out to subsidize the air dominance programs when they feel like Congress is not giving them enough for tankers or fighter jets or whatever, bombers. And they're right, Congress has not given any of the services enough for their mission. But that doesn't mean you starve to death one of your subordinate missions to fund what you perceive as your more dominant mission. And that's caused a lot of the atrophy that we've seen in our national security space capabilities.
So I'm going to go to a question here from the audience. I'm going to kind of break it into two parts. So, first part of this question is about, clearly the two of you think that we need to be reorganizing into a separate Space Corps. What do you think is a realistic timeline for doing that? How long will it take? I mean, eventually people do have to wrestle with questions of like the uniform and what are we going to call the ranks, because you're not going to call them airmen. If they're in a Space Corps. So there are some little questions like that are notoriously, controversial issues within the military if you want to change a uniform. But realistically, setting up a Space Corps, what do you think is a timeline that we ought to be on?
Well, first let me go back to this uniform thing. I'm with Jim. That's the silliest thing in the world. It's the Air Force. Air Force got blue uniforms. Make the Space Corps black. Everything else be the same except instead of have wings, you'll have an orbit or something. I don't care. Done. It's over.
All right.
It's just silly they talk about these uniforms like that's just a big reason not to deal with this national security space problem that we've got. But having said that, I think 3 to 5 years in short. And here's the way we have progressed from last year. Y'all remember the bill that we came out of the House with would have required them to design the Space Corps this year, and then we would implement it after the next NDAA. It would automatically implement, but we'd have time to tinker with, make some statutory changes based on what they designed this year. Senate, as Jim has already pointed out, was not really as on top of this issue as the House was, and in fairness, we hadn't been on top of it 2 years earlier either, so I can't be too aggravated with them. But they was like, this may not be a bad idea, may not be a good idea, but let's slow down and design it first, and then come back with the statutory kick in. So the bill that we passed required the Deputy Secretary of Defense to hire an FFRDC to basically design how do we set up a separate space service, what's it going to look like, and what's a reasonable timetable. So that's supposed to make that down select next week, in fact. And then they've got until December to have a final product to present to Congress on what that's going to look like and what they think the timetable is. I personally think 3 to 5 years is the way to get it done without being too disruptive, because we have to keep using these assets while we're in the process. Jim, what do you think?
Todd, when you ask about deadline, timeline, think about yesterday. Even the chairman's answer, 3 to 5 years. We fought and won World War II in 5 years. Remember that our defense budget is really not set by us. It's set by our adversaries. Our bureaucratic changes should not be determined at our convenience, but at what's necessary. So this is stunning that an aging and perhaps sclerotic power thinks of its own convenience ahead of everything else. We have got to get our heads in the game, think of warfighting in a new domain, and be ready for whatever threat comes at us. Because in case you don't feel it in your gut, we could be deaf, dumb, and blind within seconds no ATM would work. You couldn't find how close you are to the green at golf. You know? This really strikes home. You know?
Wouldn't be able to catch an Uber.
I know. This is seldom has a great nation been so vulnerable. And we need a cherished service to rise to the challenge and take this as seriously as we do.
So the second part of this question is about what can we do in the short term? And so in the next 1, 2, 3 years, what can we start to do, not just about reorganization, but about meeting the important mission needs? And specifically, this questioner asks, what can we do in space situational awareness and defensive counter space? What more do you want to see the department be doing?
Come out of denial that we are in this situation that we're in. Jim is right. There's a lot of you probably do know, but most of it's classified. It is bad, the situation that we are in as a nation, the vulnerabilities that we have to China and Russia. And I'd like for the American public to know more. I can't, because I don't want to go to jail for leaking classified information, but we're in a really bad situation. So the first thing they could do is just to come out of denial, admit we got a problem and that we've got to fix it, and work with us instead of fighting us. The Air Force has spent the last year on Capitol Hill fighting Congress, trying to keep us from meddling in this issue. Well, Congress wasn't meddling in it, and it allowed us to get in this situation. We have a job to do vigorous oversight, and if we find that any service is not getting their job done, it's our job to get after it. And so I want them to first start working collaboratively with us towards some answers. Jim.
And there are many people in the Pentagon who I think in large part agree with us. I've been particularly proud of Deputy Secretary of Defense Shanahan, who seems to totally get it. Many other people get it, including people within the Air Force. So we just need the bureaucracy, the brass, the official folks to get on board with enthusiasm and with speed and with clarity. I'm personally embarrassed that it takes the playthings of a couple of billionaires to help us improve and make our launch capability more affordable. It's like, it shouldn't happen that way. The Air Force has had amazing budgets for a long time to do a lot of things, and then they end up being unenthusiastic about drones because they're not piloted aircraft. Give me a break. I like leather jackets too, but that doesn't, that shouldn't be the predominant characteristic. Historians will not be kind when they look back at this period. So let's get on the right side of history here. We have a chance, we have a window. Let's not blow it.
And I want to pull on something you said, Chairman Rogers, the overclassification. Right. I guess that's my word, overclassification, but a lot of the threat information, the vulnerabilities of our satellites, but also what other countries are doing in space is classified. So people don't know about it and can't talk about it. Do you think that ought to be something that this administration addresses? Because ultimately, the administration alone can choose what is classified and what is not. Congress can't choose to declassify something. So do you have any ideas on how we can push to, in a responsible way, of course, make more information public so people are aware of what's going on?
Yeah, I completely do think that we should be looking at declassifying a lot of the stuff they now have classified, because the public really should know. Members of Congress should know about a lot of the challenges that we face. And I don't know why they overclassify it, and it's not just unique to the space, national security space. It's across the board in all of our services, I found, but particularly in this committee, Jim and I, most of what we deal with is classified. And it's disturbing that we can't let more people know, because there would be a hue and cry in the American public for us to fix this situation if they knew how bad things were and what we've allowed China and Russia to do. But the only way I know to make it, get the administration to push is talk about it. Just express frustration. If any of you can get on cable TV, apparently the president watches that a lot, so y'all might want to say something about it.
Historically, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan warned us about the dangers of overclassification. his book is still worth reading. But remember, hey, we have a dedicated service whose responsibility is space, and they are privy to all the secrets. And where has their leadership been? And again, these are good people. They are dedicated, patriotic Americans. And right now, as we speak, many of them couldn't be in Washington because they're at Maxwell Air Force Base in Mr. Rogers' home state during a war game. All I ask is that we win the war game and that we win the real thing too, because victory has been in short supply for a long time. We need to see more of that and think in those winning terms and perform so that we're at least as prepared as a Boy Scout troop, not unprepared.
Another question from the audience is about commercial space systems. And so the military is heavily reliant on commercial space systems for a number of missions, not just communications, but imagery as well, for example. And more and more, I think, in space situational awareness. Who is in charge, or who should be in charge, of integrating commercial space systems and services with our national security space systems?
Chief of Staff of the Space Corps.
Well, who do you think it is now? 'Cause
Nobody.
It's not clear.
Nobody.
Yeah.
It's just nobody.
And in all fairness, we also need to be treating cyber as a separate domain as well, and the president's on that case, apparently. There are lots of new things that we are all facing that we need to be more alert to. And we've had birthing pains in the past. People didn't like it when the Army Air Corps had to be separated out to create the Air Force in 1947. But let's be more resilient. Let's be more open to change and constructive change. We can do this. This is America. We are the can-do, practical nation. We are not bound by ideology. We are not bound by structure, or at least we didn't used to be. So let's make it work now.
Yeah, one thing I do want to point out, there was some misconceptions when we had our bill come out of the House last year, frankly, when it was on the House floor, that we were talking about creating this brand new bureaucracy out there that was going to be large and grow into a monster. We specifically put language in our bill saying they could acquire no more bases, no more buildings, no more people, that this was all about segregating existing personnel into a segregated service, the existing budget into a segregated pot. This was not about growing a large and big bureaucracy. So as y'all talk about and think about this, I hope you'll keep that in mind. And when people start saying this is just going to be another monstrous bureaucracy, it's not. This is just about making what we have more effective and capable and agile.
And to be fair, we do need to fill those billets at Space and Missile Command in LA. Like, this is something the Air Force was aware of for well over a decade. Where are the majors? Where are the captains? Hello? You can't even fill your own required positions on a systematic basis? That should be a clear indication of a problem. And yet somehow the bureaucracy didn't respond to that or made excuses. And there also has to be some hope for promotion, because most people in the services want that.
Now, the Air Force does talk a lot about pilot shortfall and not being able to fill all their pilot billets, and they've got a bonus program. I think if you sign up for, it's like more than a 10-year commitment as a pilot, you can get a bonus up to $455,000. So serious money. Do you need something like that to help retain folks in the space profession in the military, in the Air Force in particular, to fill these billets?
First, let me point out, they're talking about that when we're in an era where we're moving to pilotless airplanes. I mean, it's not this. You look at some of the stuff we're using now, it's drones. In the future, we're not going to need a lot of pilots. But they're in denial about that too, for the thing you just described. But think about this. Once we segregate the space professionals into a segregated service, how exciting that's going to be for the young people who want to be in that environment. I think that you're not going to have bonuses. There's going to be a lot of young people in our best colleges and universities who are going to be gravitated to want to work in that kind of environment. But yeah, now once you've got them there, that's one of the things that Jim made reference to. You've got to give them opportunity and culturally develop them and educationally develop them in that service. And you're going to want to retain them once you've invested in them. And I think bonuses are a good way to keep the best and brightest because the private sector offers a lot of money. But as far as recruitment, I think that you're going to find this to be a magnet for the best and brightest. Just face it, space is cool.
I think we should focus on whatever works, what's necessary, because we should be very proud of our all-volunteer service. And in certain areas, we need to attract and keep more of these wonderful and wonderfully talented volunteers. But remember, when you're talking about piloted aircraft, our showpiece new bird is the F-35. And look at the Pentagon's now official opinion about that. An unaffordable weapon system. So it's not just a shortage of pilots, it's a shortage of affordable aircraft. And we haven't even fielded the long-range bomber yet or things like that we need to do. So there seems to be a critical problem in the Air Force about its core mission. And I'm not even talking space here. I'm talking about piloted aircraft. So we've got to fix, the various problems. We're bearing in mind these are all good people, but academics would call it a collective action problem. Somehow the whole needs to be greater than the sum of the parts.
I did not intend for this panel to be all about the Space Corps, but the questions keep coming in about Space Corps. So one more. So the next question here is basically the Space Corps, as proposed in legislation last year, really only tackled Air Force space. But of course, national security space encompasses a lot more. It's NRO, and there are space components and significant space organizations in both the Navy and the Army. So, what's your long-term vision? Do we need to integrate all of those things together into a space department, or is it okay to keep space components in each of the services and the NRO?
The main reason we dealt with the Air Force only was that's where 90% of national security space is. I mean, the Navy has the MUO system only. And I talked with Admiral Richardson, and he said, I asked him, I said, if we try to pull it in, are you going to have a big problem? He said, well, we like to keep it, but I won't fight about it. And the Army SNDC has a narrow mission, but the bulk of the problem was in the Air Force. And frankly, it's as candid as I can be, we didn't want any more political pushback than we were going to get already. If we kicked that, while the Navy wasn't going to be a problem, I don't know the Army might have been. And I can guarantee the IC would have been if we'd have messed with the NRO. And plus the NRO is not as broken. I mean, they're doing a pretty good job. So there's no reason to really tinker with it. So we dealt with where the problem was. Now, getting back to the theme of your larger question, ultimately, I can see both the Navy mission and the Army mission being folded into a Space Force years down the road. That would make sense. Whether or not it would then also make sense at some other developmental stage to fold the intelligence capabilities in there, I don't know. That's way down the road as far as I'm concerned.
Todd, as you know, ever since Goldwater Nichols, which was unanimously opposed by the Pentagon, we have tried to be more joint, and it's worked remarkably well. We can be joint in this as well, preserving the equities of each service while we collaboratively work more effectively together. And I wanted to bring up a side point that hasn't been mentioned so far. There are some activities today of national security space that could be offloaded into the civilian sector when you're talking about traffic control in space. That is a very valuable planetary function that the Air Force has been performing miraculously well. But arguably it should be offloaded to a trusted civilian or neutral or even international agency that can police space accidents, because they do happen, and people need to know with authority whether it's benign or malign, and things like that need to be figured out, and the Air Force is in the process right now of figuring out the best way to handle things like that.
And Jim makes a great point. Y'all are probably all aware that we've got SpaceX talking about throwing up a few thousand satellites for a broadband capability. Boeing's talking about doing it. India has got a company talking about doing it. We could, in a not too distant future, have 100,000 of these smaller satellites in these smaller constellations providing broadband capability. This traffic issue he's talking about is going to become more and more complex. And one of the problems that we have is that if we're going to be the traffic cop and figure all this out, why should we be paying for everybody else to have these constellations? Why should the American government be paying for China or Russia or India to have broadband constellations and without them paying for it? So that's another issue we're going to have to grapple with. If there's going to be a traffic cop that is us, somebody else is going to have to help pay for it.
So turning to some specific programmatic questions, one of the questions from the audience here is about GPS OCX, the ground segment part of GPS system. That program has had a lot of scheduled delays, some cost overruns. Do you want to see the Air Force make more changes to try to reform that program, or do we just need to let it stabilize and try to execute on the current program of record?
That program is a perfect example of the problem we have in the Air Force. We've had that black hole for money for years, and it's still not able to be executed. And show me the person responsible for that. You can't. It's all those committees. They all pointing at each other. Oh, it's not me, it's them. It's not me, it's them. In the meantime, we still don't have the capability, and we don't see an end in sight. And this thing has been incredibly over budget. I want to have somebody who owns that, give them the power to fix it and the time. But the Air Force won't do that. But no, I think that we need to get it right. I don't think we should just stop with what it can do right now. But I don't see that happening. I've been so disappointed in that program.
Properly understood, the Constitution makes Congress a board of directors. We shouldn't micromanage. We should look at the big policy decisions and then let capable services implement them. But this is a situation that really is a nightmare. To have satellite capability and no ground communications for over a decade and really no hope in sight. And with no accountability, this would never stand for a second in the corporate world. And the corporate world is not perfect, but at least there tends to be accountability.
So when y'all think that we're being too rough on them, think about this program. I mean, this is our job to be rough on whoever's got responsibility for that when it's not getting done year after year after year. So it's not that we're hateful people. It's just...
Well, you might be.
So let me follow up with a broader question here. Both of you have mentioned that there's a need for space acquisitions to go faster. Can you name specific programs or mission areas where you think that the Air Force or other services could accelerate what they're trying to do?
That was one, but a replacement for SIBRs. That's one of the things John Hyten talked about, that they're saying it could be 8 to 10 years. That was the program he was talking about. Anybody who knows what SIBR's #1 mission is knows that's really important for us to get right. If we got to detect an adversary launching an ICBM at us, the private sector can fix this. If you put somebody, a CEO, in charge of that, why can't the Air Force? I don't know the answer.
And in the FY19 budget, it does appear that they're trying to accelerate that program. Any comments on that or thoughts on that?
You kind of wonder what's connected to what, because the money is usually there in large part. We usually accede to whatever the military request is the best we can. Now, there was a terrible problem with sequestration, but that's been temporarily cured. I think the real answer to your question is 3 letters, NRO. It's kind of amazing the difference in capability and speed of acquisition and flatter organizational design and accountability. And it's not perfect, but very rarely in bureaucracy do you have a control group that you can point to. So there have got to be ways to solve these problems. We're not experts, but we get the feeling that in the old days, the program managers had real pride. Some people refused promotion because they were so invested in the program and really did a superb job, and they were technically capable, and they really weren't contractor driven. They knew what they were doing. That seems to have been lost. And I have to question, because in many ways I admire Navy accountability for things. And people put in charge of reactors are there for 6 or 8 years and do a great job, and you know where the buck stops. Some of the other services have not shared that organizational design. And if the Navy can do it, why can't other services do it?
So another question from the audience here is, if you look in the FY19 budget request overall, it looks like space funding is starting to go up. Is that the Air Force sending a strong message that they are prioritizing space and they're coming around? Or do you think they still need to do more?
They need to do a lot more, but I think that's the Air Force trying to get us to leave them alone.
Is it going to work?
No.
Any other thoughts on that?
Ditto.
All right. Another question is, given budget realities and the need to, you never have infinite resources, right? So it's always finite in some respect. So you do have to balance at some level funding that goes into innovative new technologies versus funding that's needed to just maintain the systems that we've got and the capabilities that we have today. How do you think we should strike that balance? Are we leaning too much towards maintaining existing systems, not enough towards innovation? If you want to do more in both, where should the cuts come from to pay for it?
I would say we have to do more in innovation, particularly in counter space capabilities. And I think there is some more aggressive activity going on that we can't talk about in this room right now to deal with the threats from China in particular and Russia. But we have to be a lot more innovative, and I mean fast.
Todd, when you say that we don't have infinite resources, that's of course true in a mathematical sense. But is there any other power on Earth that wouldn't fight, bleed, and die to have our budgets? And yet we squander so much of what we have. So we have to learn how to be more efficient with what we are spending. And of course, no one wants to do that. So I'm worried that when we use phrases like that, of course, we don't have infinite budgets. That's kind of an aging superpower starting to make excuses. And to me, most innovation is science-driven. Well, who can predict what scientists will discover? And I just hope enough of them are in DARPA or related fields right now so that we do have a big head start. Because when most every chip on the planet is made in a rival nation, when a lot of this is almost impossible even for artificial intelligence to begin to figure out, when there are lots of other things happening technically, we better be ahead. And I worry that as a nation, we not only badmouth science, we underinvest in science. And we don't let science just be scientists. So we really got to focus on that. And I'm worried that increasingly, as all elites are challenged, that we have hurt our scientific community and hurt them within the services.
Yeah, I would like to make one point that we hadn't talked about, and that is, in a time when you've seen Congress for years be completely partisan and marred down in conflict, when it's come to national security space, you hadn't seen it. Me and Jim, as y'all can tell, we're good friends, but on our committee, it came out of our subcommittee unanimously, the mark last year. It came out of the full committee, 66 members, there were only 3 people who verbally voted no. This is not, there's no partisanship, and it came out of the House in a huge vote. So while you see a lot of yakking up there and pointing fingers, when it's come to this issue, it has not been the case. And that should tell you a lot, those people who are paying attention, how serious this problem is and how sobering the Congress is taking it. This is not partisan in any way.
Well, so I want to pull on that thread a bit. So, in the NDAA last year, the House passed the Space Corps provision. The Senate didn't. And the Senate, at least initially in their bill, they went in a very different direction, basically creating a little office in OSD that would do cyber and space. But they didn't seem, and especially Chairman McCain, didn't seem to be on the same page. Have you guys had a lot of discussions since then? Do you see the Senate moving more towards you, or you moving towards them? How's that going?
Yeah, I'll go back to my comment earlier. In fairness, the Senate Armed Services Committee hadn't been focused on this, and I couldn't beat them up because 2 years earlier we hadn't been. This really, kind of kicked us in the face pretty quick and got our attention when we started working on it. So, when they saw this, they weren't saying, "Oh, that's a terrible idea." They were like, "This is a big thing, real fast. Slow down." And in some of the language you saw, that was the Air Force politicking over there, trying to find a way to kill this. We view, now that this issue has been raised legislatively with the Senate, they're taking this year to kind of immerse themselves in this. One of the things that we're hoping this FFRDC study will help them get to understand how we can fix this problem. But they are, in this year, I think, becoming much more familiar with how bad things are, just like we went through that evolutionary period. So I think that you're going to find this year is going to be, they're going to be becoming much more familiar, and I hope moving more to the position of doing something in the vein of what the House proposed.
I think we're both huge fans, and who isn't, of Senator McCain, Senator Nelson. These are heroic figures. But remember, being senator is a lot tougher job than ours. We look after 700,000 people apiece. They look after entire states, and some of those states are pretty darn large. And they have too many committee assignments. They're on 4 major committees, and they're torn in 1,000 different directions. So we've had more time to spend with some of the briefs and to focus on this issue. So I think when they get the time to do that, you're going to see them substantially agreeing with us.
So I got more of a process technical question here. So in the FY17 NDAA, so the one before last, the NDAA mandated 2 studies be done on space organization, one by OMB, one by DoD, and they were supposed to be submitted 6 months after the NDAA passed, so that would have been in June of last year. As far as I can tell, neither OMB or DoD submitted those reports on time. I think OMB submitted theirs back in December. I don't know if DoD ever submitted theirs.
Correct.
Now, in the FY18 NDAA, it has the reporting requirement of this independent FFRDC study. It is due by December of this year. Do you think they're going to meet that deadline, and what would be the consequences if they don't?
Absolutely, and the reason why we feel confident is specifically because of the history you described. We gave it to Deputy Secretary Shanahan. He's a corporate guy. He has our confidence. He gets it. He wants to fix it, and we have been staying in regular contact with him on this, and we are going to stay in regular contact with him. I have every confidence in Deputy Secretary Shanahan and his ability to get this done, and I expect it to be on time and productive.
I would encourage you to go back and look at the 9/11 Commission report. Their central conclusion was that we had a failure of imagination. We did not connect the dots. There were plenty of warning signs. Here, we cannot afford to have a failure of imagination. And so many think tanks, they want an acceptable report, a popular report with services. They don't want to break too much China. Here, we need to be as imaginative as we need to be. And I think there are plenty of warning signs. It's our bad if we don't respond appropriately.
So I want to end here. We're almost out of time. I want to end on a positive note. All right.
We'll talk football?
I don't know. That could get controversial. We don't want any controversy here. So, what do you see that the Air Force is doing right? What positive steps do you see the Air Force taking, and DoD at large, when it comes to national security space?
I have been pleased to see them, we changed the Air Force Command position that Jay Raymond has to a 6-year tenure. And I've seen them start to vest him with more authorities, and I think that's a good move on their part. I just hope they continue to do that.
The personnel in the Air Force, some of the finest in America or in the world. We just need to let them live up to their full potential in whatever their field of expertise. If they want to be fighter pilots, great. If they want to be space people, great. And the many other activities, because the Air Force has one of the broader portfolios of any service. It's an amazing amazing institution. But we need to allow all of them to grow to their full potential, and I think the Space Corps would help them do that.
All right. Please join me in thanking Representative Rogers and Cooper.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Right in to our next panel discussion. So I'm going to invite up to the stage. I assume they're back here.
Good job,
Representatives Lamborn and Rupersberger. See where they
You need
are.
a ride back, Jim?
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
That's about as quick as we can do a changeover.
Okay, that's pretty good.
At a think tank here. Welcome, both of you. Thank you both for joining us here today. To my right is Representative Dutch Rupersberger, represents the 2nd Congressional District in Maryland, is a member of many committees in the House, but for our purposes here, most interesting to us is you're an appropriator on the Defense Subcommittee, the House Appropriations Committee. And on the end here, we have Representative Lamborn, who represents the 5th Congressional District in Colorado. He is also on the House Armed Services Strategic Forces Subcommittee and the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee. Both of you are co-chairs of the Space Power Caucus in Congress. I'll start with you, Representative Rupersberger, if you want to make a few opening
I'm
comments.
glad to be here with people involved in space. Space is one of the most important things that we do in our country, and the public just aren't aware of how important space is, which is of great concern because that deals with money. And I think it's important that we do more with all those involved, not you, but companies involved in space. Defense contractors, I've had these conversations with all of our DOD, Intel to an extent, and then NASA. Why do we need space? Where is space? I was on the elevator this morning on the Hill before I came, and the person said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to go give a little talk about space." He said, "Well, you know, we've got to watch putting too much money in there and being redundant." And I said, "Okay, fine, you know, whatever." But I think today we're going to have questions. I think today that my theme and what I'm going to try to get across is to talk about where we are in Congress, what we can do. I think Doug, I'm happy that Doug is here today, and there are not many people on the Hill that really are involved and work with space.
All right, Representative Lamborn.
Well, it's great to be here with you all. Thanks for your interest, and I know in your daily lives you're very involved with technical and other aspects of space. I thank CSIS for inviting us. This is the 3rd year in a row I've been here, and that's an honor and a privilege. And it's great to be with Dutch. He's someone who really gets it when it comes to national defense, intelligence issues, and space issues. And I'll agree with Dutch. Funding is all important. I think it's good that we have this current fiscal year top line of $700 billion and 716 for the next fiscal year. That's huge. The president's budget, which is as far as we've gone in the budget process yet, we're about to have our own numbers for underneath the top line number for each of the different line items. But he's asking for $8.7 billion for the disclosed part of what we do in space. And that's a 4% increase. So I guess I'm happy for that we're taking steps in the right direction. I still don't think we're adequately funding space. I think people in Congress do understand the importance of the nuclear enterprise because they see what's happening with countries like China and Russia, our near peers, but also when it comes to missile defense, and that plus space, military space are the three things that we really talk about in strategic forces. When it comes to missile defense, with the activity of Kim Jong-un in North Korea, people get it and understand the importance of that. So I think we have better funding streams now, and we're in a better trajectory for missile defense. But military space really hasn't caught up. It's a threat that is out there. You all probably know it really, really well, but the American public doesn't quite know it. And that's why it's good we're doing the Space Power Caucus. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but Congress and the American public really needs to get a better awareness of the threats we face and the commiserate need for adequate funding for space.
So I want to pick up on that idea in the Space Power Caucus. Why did you restart it? What's the need? What do you hope to achieve?
Okay, I'll start that one and then have Dutch follow on. But and we're both co-chairs of that. Years ago, Senator Wayne Allard of Colorado and Representative Jane Harman of California had a Space Power Caucus. When they went on and left Congress, it sort of fell into a vacuum. And some of us realized, hey, there's a land power caucus, sea power caucus, air power caucus, but no space power caucus. We felt it was necessary to recognize the need for that domain to get its own attention and priority. So that's why we started it. The object is to educate fellow members of Congress and their staff and to coordinate with defense and people in the private sector with Congress and to make sure that space gets the attention and priority that it deserves.
I would hope that it does get the attention. And first, I want to acknowledge you, Doug, Adam Schiff, and Bridenstine,
Yes.
who's the nominee for director of NASA. And they came together and decided we need to have more advocacy in space, and they really put it together and did a good job. And that's why we're trying to be more aggressive. You know, one of the things that has hurt us in the last 3 or 4 years is sequestration, cutting everything across the board.
Yeah.
And what really bothered me is some of the mentality of certain people in Congress is cut everything across the board. And you know, budgeting is about priorities. It's not about cutting across the board. And if there's one thing that we have to make sure that we focus on is space. You know, Russia and China are up there. It's, you know, space is it's a contested environment right now. And we have to realize that. And if we don't, we're going to be a less powerful country in the world. We have to look at history. How did we get to be so active in space? It was Sputnik. And we responded to Sputnik. President Kennedy put millions and millions, if not billions of dollars. We put more money into space than anyone, and we really grew. And then after World War II, we got about 2/3 of the German rocket scientists, and Russia got about 1/3. And that even helped us more in the space industry. And we were rocking and rolling. I remember when I grew up, we went to the moon. We knew the names of the astronauts in those days. Now our kids know the names of NFL quarterbacks, but they don't know astronauts. Maybe Kelly, because of his wife, really. So we have to make sure that we really focus and we let the leadership, whoever the president may be, whoever is involved, know that. So You know, I think that the more that we can market, the more that we can talk about why space is important, and not just for defense, not just for intelligence, not just for what NASA does. I mean, just the everyday operations, the GPS systems. Most people don't have a clue, and we better let them know, because it's an easy cut if you don't.
That's right. All right, so I want to quickly remind the audience, if you want to ask a question, go to our website. You can see the address here. If you don't have a phone or a tablet, you can submit your question. Just write it down on a piece of paper, give it to Thomas back there, the one with the laptop waving, the back of the room. You know, my next question for both of you is, you look at what's going on in the commercial space sector. A lot of exciting things going on, not just a Tesla getting launched into space with the spaceman in there, but a lot of real, useful technology being developed. It seems to be a real resurgence in energy in the commercial space market. Do you think DoD and the national security community need to be doing more to tap into that?
I think commercial, we need to focus a lot more on commercial, and we have. You know, when you look at the government versus commercial, the commercial is doing a lot of the research and development. Elon Musk is a character, but we have to give him credit. I mean, when he sued the Air Force, I said, what are you doing? I mean, and as it turned out, he got attention. I'd love to have the competition. Now, all my friends in Lockheed and Boeing and Northrop Grumman, all, they said, well, you like SpaceX? I said, I don't like any of you. I want you all to do well. But this guy's a character, and he is marketing space, and that's what we need to do. He makes it exciting. And whether or not he's going to fail or not, I don't think so. We can't let him fail now. I mean, what he is doing. But that doesn't mean that ULA and the other companies that we have, they're doing good work, but they all have budget issues. They don't know where the money's going to come from down the road. These are things we have to work on. And that's why I'm really excited, and I voted. For about 50 of us who were Democrats who voted for this budget. There's some issues that we have to deal with there as far as the deficit and all of that. But right now, today, with the Russia-China threat, with the Iran threat, with the North Korea threat, with all those threats and issues out there, we need to make sure that we keep focusing on the issue of space. And if it makes it exciting, so be it.
I really agree with Dutch, and I think that the military can do more, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, I do want to say that I think the ones I've talked to, the higher ups in the Pentagon, do have an awareness that the commercial side really has a lot to offer. It can be cost effective. They like we in Congress like the fact that the commercial sector will absorb a lot of the risk as part of their business plan. So that's good for the taxpayer. But I think we can do more. There's so much to offer. I think particularly in imaging, I think there's some great resources out there that we can and should be using. And I just really think it's a fruitful field where we can and should do more. And I'm really excited about the possibilities. I do think, especially with the prodding of people like Dutch and I, the DoD will continue to look at that, as they should. But I think they've heard that message. But we can do more because the R&D, the creativity, is so good in the private sector. I think that's where the commercial side really excels, is R&D and creativity, and that's the American asymmetrical advantage that I want to see us really harness and take advantage of.
So I'm going to go to a question from the audience here. It really picks up on what you both talked about and the need to reform the Space Power Caucus. If the goal is to better educate the American public about the need for space power, how do you address the concerns of people that when they hear space power, they think it's warmongering? They think it's that we're going to be the aggressor in space, that we want to fight a war in space. How do you address those kind of concerns?
Well, that's not what the term really means. That's a very surface impression, and hopefully people will probe just a tiny bit and realize we're just wanting America to fully engage in space. So that's really what we're talking about. So we do occasionally hear, even in our subcommittee and in the full committee on armed services, people talking about weaponizing space and how that is something we don't want to do. And they're way, they're decades behind when they say that. No one is wanting to put weapons into space other than we want to make sure that we're matching what our near peers are doing. We don't want to let them get away with something and we have an artificial constraint on ourselves and don't match them for the things that they might anticipate doing.
If it's not classified, we need to be more transparent. Right now, I actually represent NSA, and I was a ranking member of the Intelligence Committee before I was termed out. And I had to deal with the Snowden issue. And there was so much distrust of American people of what NSA does not break the law. They have their checks and balances. But if you were to hear some people say NSA, and yet here we are, the same thing with space. Space protects us. But it also does a lot of other things too, in the commercial end. And we need the people to know, number one, what is the threat? And the threats are probably as severe as we've ever had. When I was a member of the, when I was ranking member of the Intelligence Committee with Mike Rogers, and people we were what we call the Gang of Eight. We get the most sensitive information. And people would say, well, what keeps you up at night? And I'd say, well, about 5 things. First, spicy Mexican food. I had to get one joke in there today. Secondly, the nuclear. If Russia, China, and the United States get into a nuclear war, the Earth basically will be over. I mean, we can't defend. We can stop probably China. We can stop Russia, but I mean, we can't have a nuclear war. But then you get into the other areas like the cyber and the space and those arenas. If we don't start dealing and focusing and let people know what the threat is and how we're dealing with it, if people knew what the threat is, and all of the people that are saying we can't spend money, we can't do this, we can't do this. Let me tell you, sequestration has put us back for 3 years. That's cutting across the board, and we're making it up right now, hopefully. And you've got defense. I think missile defense is a high priority. Yes. We have to deal with that. But the intelligence area, which I really can't talk about, but we know what happens in that regard. And don't forget what NASA does, the research and development, and this can bring our country together if we do it the right way. I mean, look, we've got a lot of other problems in this country now. I mean, but look, we survived the Civil War, we'll move forward, believe me, as a country, because we are the best country in the world. So I think really transparency on issues that aren't classified is important to let people know what space does. Just a GPS system as an example.
Well, I want to pull on that thread a bit. One thing that we talked about in the last session was, the idea that perhaps too much is classified when it comes to space, and we're hamstrung and we're not able to talk about with the American public about what's really going on out there and the threats we're facing in space. Do you think that there's a balance to be struck here where maybe we should be declassifying more information about what's going on in space? And would that make your jobs easier as a Space Power Caucus trying to communicate to people and educate them?
That's a great question, and that's always an impediment that stops us from going as far as we would like in educating the American people. I think about a year ago, 60 Minutes did a great job when they talked to General Hyten. I'll bet everyone here saw that. General Hyten and others about the challenge that we're facing, and he did a masterful job of talking without revealing classified information about how this is a serious issue and there's a serious threat out there. And if we stand by idly or don't fully use our resources, our ingenuity and creativity and our ability to fund that, then we're going to be bypassed. And in some regards, maybe we already have.
Also, you need to have the partnership between the government, the military, the intelligence community, and the private sector. And the more that we do that, the more that people will know and understand where we are. So that has to be done for a lot of reasons. But it's also from a funding point of view, from research and development and that type of thing. The more you do that, the more that you hopefully will let people know. I've always asked, I call them the big boys, the largest defense contractors, just take a little bit of money, pull it together, and start putting together, hire what's the most popular advertisement out there now? Probably Gecko. Maybe he's one of them. Get Gecko out there and start talking about space so that the average person understands what it does, how important it is, but we have to keep funding it. So far, we've been okay, but I tell you, with sequestration, that has hurt us, and we're not where we need to be at all. And I'm really worried about China and Russia. I mean, you know, Putin's put all his money into space, cyber, military, and that's about it. And China, we know what China's doing. And again, you know, the space is not ours anymore. We controlled it a little bit after Sputnik, but what we have now is very, very serious. And we need to have ingenuity. We need to have research and development. The other thing that concerns me about space too is the younger generation is not going into space. And that concerns me. You know, they'll go to cyber, they'll go wherever you need to go. But space is long term. So we need to get them excited. You know, when I grew up and we went to the moon, I knew the names of the astronauts. But now people don't really know that anymore. So we have to have, and that's why I want to call out Elon Musk again. You know, he's an entrepreneur, and he knows he takes these projects and he moves forward with them. But he brought some kind of excitement. And if you look at our history, we do very, very well when we have competition. But you've got to produce. So I would hope that we would really focus in that regard, letting the public know from a communication and transparency. Look, I served on the Intelligence Committee. I was leadership of the Intelligence Committee, and you know, we have to protect our sources and methods. But that's about it, because you'll find that a lot of things that we think are classified, our enemies know it anyhow. So let's move on, and Snowden showed that.
Well, and you recall a few years ago, there was a Super Bowl ad for the bomber. Maybe we need to see a spy satellite behind a piece of cloth like that.
Right.
We'll see. That's kind of expensive. Next question from the audience here. This is directed to Congressman Rupersberger, but I think both of you could probably weigh in on this. Given the emphasis that we're seeing on cybersecurity and the important role it plays across all of our weapon systems in all domains, should Congress make cybersecurity and its relationship to space more of a priority, and should this be part of an organizational restructuring of the national security space?
Well, my answer to that is very simple. It is. It goes hand in hand. The cyber and the space all working together on a regular basis, and again, have to keep moving ahead. And I do want to get back again to the younger generation. We have to make it exciting. So maybe we can take some of the cyber issues and let them know you're right in the middle of it with respect to space.
I really don't have anything to add. I think Dutch covered that one real well.
John Nichols, did you ask that question? No.
Let's see here. Representative Lamborn, another question for the audience, this one directed to you. You mentioned General Hyten on 60 Minutes, talking about the threats, trying to drive home the message there. Could you give us a better sense of what specifically China and Russia are doing in space that the U.S. needs to counter? And do you see signs in the FY19 budget request that the U.S. is starting to pivot and respond to those threats that we're facing?
Okay, I got to be careful how I answer this. Everyone knows about the 2007 ASAT. When China took one of its missiles from the ground and shot down one of its satellites in space, creating tens of thousands of pieces of debris in the process. So we know that capability is out there, and that's 10 years old. What is more recent and is troubling is, I think, just to know that Russia and China realize we have some vulnerabilities. We have some very exquisite platforms for military communications and surveillance and so on. Very state-of-the-art, very expensive platforms that take years to put up into space. The R&D, the manufacturing, and installing it, is a long process. So I'll just summarize by saying they know we have some vulnerabilities because we have I don't want to say we have all our eggs in one basket, but we have a lot of capabilities on a finite number of platforms. So they're aware of that, and they're looking for ways to counteract and defeat or neutralize those capabilities. And they're not standing still. So rather than getting into specifics, I just want to say that they're not standing idly by. They know that we have the best eyes and ears and communication And if we lose our capability in space, we'd be deaf, dumb, and blind. And our warfighters would suffer as a result. So I think it's just enough to say that they know what our capabilities and vulnerabilities are, and they're looking for ways to attack those.
Space is a contested environment. We have to realize that. And we can have Russian satellites come right up to our satellites. And it's not just Russia and China. That's our biggest threat, by the way, because they're moving ahead. Innovation. I mean, a lot of Putin's buddies, his oligarchs, his billionaires over there are very upset because he's putting all his money into military, space, cyber, and that's something we have to deal with. That's my answer, and Doug, I think he answered the right way, and it has to do again with budgeting. We have to make sure that we have the money. And this budget for the next 2 years, we have to take advantage of it. I know one of the areas, I just had a conversation with Heather Wilson last night, the new secretary. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Heather and I worked together it's great to be in the majority. I haven't been there in a long while. But when we were in the majority, I was chairman of the Technical Tactical Committee on Intelligence. So we did a lot of space, and we did a report on space. We had 1 year where I brought in I call them the big boys. And I said, our space industry is hurting. We're not where we need to be. Our acquisition's having problems. We've got a lot of issues. And let's have a tabletop to make recommendations for the next president, whether it was McCain or Obama. It turned out to be Obama. And we did by the way, I had one company that said we're not coming. And I kind of sat down with them. I said, you're the only one. I don't know how long I'm going to be here, but as far as I'm concerned, this is a national security issue. If you don't come, then you and I are going to have war for a long time. And okay, we're going to come. And then it all came together. And we put together, maybe I should get a copy of that report. I don't know how many years ago it was, but the recommendations of what we needed to do with space and acquisition and also, again, the issue of launch. Our launch was so expensive. Boeing and ULA with Boeing and Lockheed had to be there. They were put together for a purpose, and they served a good purpose. But when our American companies had to go to other parts of the world to get launched, because of not even the cost, but because of the timing. So that's where Elon Musk came in, and that's how that competition started to help. But ULA still, in my opinion, is probably the best launcher in the world.
And if I could add something. First of all, I want to say that, Dutch, there is a way you can become part of the majority tomorrow.
Really?
But,
any announcements here?
Yeah. Are you retiring with everybody else?
Seriously, what used to be called operationally responsive space, now the Space Rapid Capabilities Office, that I think is a key going forward. Finding ways to replace, if there's ever a crisis and we lose certain key platforms, replacing those in a hurry, or having them distributed in such a way that it becomes near impossible to take away that capability. So this is where the private sector and the creativity that needs to be harnessed really comes in. Finding ways to take certain capabilities and making them so widespread and so easy to duplicate if necessary, or at least mostly duplicated to survive a crisis, that even takes away the incentive for someone to destroy those exquisite platforms that we have out there.
So use better resilience of our space systems as a way, as a deterrent.
Exactly.
So people won't try to attack us.
Exactly. And I think we've been pushing that in Congress, and I know the Department of Defense and the intelligence community really understands that as well.
So another question from the audience here. We've talked here about the need to innovate, the need to acquire things faster, but there's a fundamental conservatism or risk aversion when it comes to military R&D, and it's part of the military culture for good reasons. You don't want to be going out and taking unnecessary chances because people's lives are at risk. But when it comes to space, I think a lot of people agree we need to be taking more chances if we really want to innovate, and we don't want others to leap ahead of us in the future in terms of technology and space and counter space weapons. What do you think Congress can do to push the military, to push industry, to help us kind of regain that innovative spirit that we had, in the past?
Well, I'll tackle that one first. I think that some of the reforms that we saw in last year's NDAA, some people call it Space Corps, whatever we call it, I think we need to make it easier for the Air Force or the final status of whatever emerges, because that's being studied real hard right now. And that was the compromise between the House and the Senate. So it's being studied real hard, and we're going to take seriously what the recommendations are. But to have more accountability, to have less bureaucracy, to have fewer levels of people who can say no, will help make decisions go faster. And that's one reform that will help. When you have caution with using the taxpayers' dollars, or caution in making sure the mission gets done no matter what, that's great. I understand that. But when you have bureaucratic caution, where it's because of an institutional inertia, and people are either protecting their own turf or their own careers or reputation, that's the kind of inertia we don't need. And that's what we have to root out and get past.
Communication to the public is still important. If you want to talk about what we need first, it's money. You have to have good management. What are our priorities? We really have three sectors in space. You have NASA, you have the defense side, and the intel side. Those are our priorities. And then I keep getting back to it. We've got to start focusing and letting the younger generation know how we need them in the area of rocket science and marketing. Everybody wants to be in cyber now. Everything's about cyber. Well, a lot of those people, if you're Russia or China, you're a communist country, you can order your 4.0 students to go into space. But we can't do that, so we have to motivate people. And then you have to worry about duplication. It's basic management. What's your mission? Identify your mission, and you can't have a lot of different missions. I think if the American public knew the threats out there and what really goes on up in space and how it would affect their everyday life if we had battles, and we have to let them know probably that I hope we will never have it. But if we have a World War III, a lot of it's going to be in space and cyber too. So these are things we have to communicate to the American public. So from my point of view, and by the American public don't get it, most of the elected officials who don't know anything about space either are not going to fund it. And that can be of concern. I'm an appropriator. On the defense appropriations, you have Ken Calvert and I, he's from California, and we're the only two on that committee that really have worked a lot in space. And I hadn't for a while because as ranking member on Intel, I had to deal with all the Russia-China threats and ISIS and that type of thing.
Let me add to what Dutch is saying. I don't think the American people really understand, and many in Congress don't either, but how vulnerable we would be if our space assets were to suddenly disappear or be hugely damaged. You couldn't make bank transactions. You couldn't pump gas. You couldn't use your GPS. You couldn't have a lot of cellular communication. I mean, there'd be so many things that would fall to the ground and disappear, and people wouldn't know what to do with their lives. So maybe we as a community, space community, can and should be doing a better job of communicating how important it really is to the American people and what would happen to us if we were deprived of that.
You have you have unstable people, in my opinion, like Trump calls Rocket Man. But who knows what happens when you put a cat in a corner and they threaten them. So these are things that we have to communicate to our American public.
Yeah.
Transparency.
Yeah.
Well, looks like we are out of time already, and I know you both have to get back on the Hill for important things going on there. So please join me in thanking...
And Steve, thanks for helping me put this together too. Steve Jakes.
Thank you.
Okay.
And we're going to take a 15-minute coffee break, and we'll reconvene at 9:45.
Okay, take care. Thanks, good job.
Thank you.
Right.